There's that. And welcome, everyone. I think you've heard my part of the birth story of my middle daughter. Oh, hold on. All right, why don't you guys talk a little bit so I can get your volume and whatnot.
Darius, why don't you talk about your first time DMing?
Uh, Technically, my first time DMing was a one shot a while ago, and
Oh yeah, the Pokemon one, right?
I like wanted this idea of a one shot in a Pokemon-esque world where ultimately all the players happened to decide to be turtles. So then they were also fashioned to be like Ninja Turtles. So it was like a lot of 90s cartoon nostalgia, where I was getting like really in depth. I was like, all right, if they're gonna have like these starter Pokemon, what's like a good equivalent monster that's kind of like that, but they're all, have relatively the same CR that they can control as like a buddy in battle. But so that was fun. And of course, the first time doing, I like custom made this puzzle that it took me like 2 days to like build it, and they solve it in like 5 minutes. I was like, I guess it wasn't that hard.
You know, I've
It was
discovered that the amount of time that it takes players to solve a puzzle is actually inversely proportional to the amount of work that you put into the puzzle.
Yep.
The less work you put in, the harder it is. And by less work, I mean a simple Google uh, often is the best. So yeah, so welcome, welcome everyone. Now that we got all of our tech issues resolved, welcome to Ask the DM. I'm your host, DM Bob Yo. We have DM Tony with us, and special guest today, Darius. Now, we haven't been on in a couple of weeks, so welcome back, those of you that are rejoining us, and welcome to those who are brand new. As always, whatever format you're watching on YouTube, Twitch, or Facebook, make sure to like, subscribe, and all that stuff. I'm about halfway on YouTube subscribers to where I can have a custom URL. So if you haven't liked on YouTube, even if you normally watch on Twitch or Facebook, shoot over to the YouTube channel, and you can find that through either Facebook or Twitch, whichever you're normally watching on. So, all right. So yeah, Darius, we've started out a little bit learning a little bit about Darius's first time DMing. Tell me a little more, Darius, about not just your first time DMing, but your history with role playing games. What's your background?
Sure. Well, not so much role-playing games, but I've always been involved in theater, and that sort of stemmed from a very lack of self-confidence, sort of just putting yourself out there and like taking on these roles that, I always joke with Tony and other friends that I really like lying. Like lying is so fun and easy, and that's like what it is. But then when you're really in the character, like your character's not lying, etc. So it actually was through theater that ultimately I found someone and a couple people who like played D&D, and I was like, I've always been interested. It'd be great if like you're starting something and I can like just hop in. I think I can fold in pretty naturally. And at that point, I don't know, like 6 years ago maybe. So I guess in the grand scheme of things, maybe not like super recently in terms of role-playing games, but that's sort of how it started. It stemmed through theater. So like a lot of from the player side being able to tap into character work and trying to find motivations, but then layering in the gaming part of it, which I've always like been drawn to, of combat and mechanics and things like that. Is a great combination.
Yeah, I find that theater folks are some of the coolest to have. Honestly, as a DM, they're some of the coolest players to have because on both a micro, where the idea of characterization, where they're building, their sort of their character identities and whatnot, tends to be pretty in depth and detailed personalities, right? So where there, a lot of us that have been playing D&D since we were kids, we just sort of force our own personalities onto the character, no matter what it is, and that's okay too. I mean, I'm not. Everybody plays the game differently, and everybody enjoys what they enjoy, and so I'm definitely not criticizing that, right? But for part of what I enjoy is jumping into a different character. For me, it's often an idealized version of myself, right? So I DM mostly, but when I play, I've played lots of different characters over the years, but mostly I always come back to an elven wizard because, for me, the idealized DM Bob is brilliant and knowledgeable and powerful. And I specifically I play control wizards, right? I loved, especially modern D&D, really fourth and fifth edition both. I've really loved the ability to sort of move everything around on the battlefield like my own personal chess pieces as the wizard. I'm less interested in fireball than I am in, I don't know, lightning lure, right? And what's the spell I used in my Monday night game last night? It's out of Fizz Bands. I think it's out of Fizz Bands. It's I don't know. You cast a spell, they make a con save, and you yeet them, the opponent, to another spot. So
Vortex warp.
yes, vortex warp. Thank you, Tony. And yeah, so
I think that's Strixhaven.
is it Strix? Okay, I knew it was one of the newer books. Yeah, vortex warp. I'm like, let me put you here, and since I'm on the other side of my party member, and in that game we're using the optional flanking rules, I just yeeted him right into the center there, so we've got advantage. So my fighter that I'm on the outside of has advantage. So, and I, on an individual level, I have generalized anxiety disorder. So I struggle with anxiety, and anxiety is all about control. So my elfin wizard is able to control things. So sort of an idealized version of myself. What do you guys tap into for your characters? Do you do some, is it to some degree idealized version of yourself, or do you look at other archetypes?
I think to start, so the first character I was a paladin, and I've been in some one shots, some other campaigns that have fizzled out, and I've tried to be a different class all the time. But maybe it's because I've been it the longest, or it's not like I mean, divine smite, one trick pony, but like there's more you can do with it. I'm like drawn to that idea of being this defender type that maybe has some other tricks on the sleeve, but this idea, especially like looking at the features of a paladin, it's about, um, you have these emanating auras and like surrounding yourself with people. It's really supporting ally focused as well. Like I've always, my greatest achievement or drive is to like surround myself with good people and good friends. So while that's not like a total one-to-one, I think that's part of the mentality. Like I've grown accustomed and attached to the paladin. But even like in other video games, like in Mass Effect, like I'm drawn to being the Vanguard. Like, and I would say that's probably, Tony, you maybe could speak closer to it. I think that's like the one-to-one to a paladin. Like you're really in the fray, you're in the thick of things, you're like melee, but you can have some other capabilities.
And you generally like to help people.
Yeah. Not so much so that I want to be the cleric, but
No, well, no one really wants to be the
yeah.
cleric, right? I mean, we not in game. I mean, right, in the real world, some people do take on sort of that role. But what about you, Tony? Where do you pull
Uh,
from?
I also have a soft spot for wizards. I've played almost every class. I haven't played a paladin or a druid, but I think I've played every other, including a blood hunter. Um, and I just, I really like my artificer wizard. She's my favorite character. Uh, and but I think it's not quite control, but it's more utility. And maybe this reflects something in real life where I always want options, especially a way out. If I'm trapped, I sort of panic. So, I'll prepare weird spells. Um,
Like pocket
I don't know,
case, pocket case type
like
spells, right? Like,
yeah, like arcane eye or contact other plane, or like when I just want the answer, or even like what was it? Galder's not Speedy Courier, but the tower. I think it's just called Galder's Tower, where you just have a lab. Uh, which oftentimes I don't have the vertical height to cast it because we're in the Underdark. But yeah, my favorite spells are like Speedy Courier, um, and Secret Chest. I really sort of need options and a way out. I
mhm.
don't necessarily care about. It's super nice to obliterate the enemy, but my wizard seldom has fireball prepared. I think my sorcerer has cast it only a couple times. I usually prefer uh, like holding spells, or suggestion is one I use all the time, uh, because there's a lot more you can do with it, and you can be a little creative with it. And that's also why um, I have like a whole collection of stuff I build
Oh
things
my.
with, and I learned jujitsu, also to sort of get out of a sticky situation. Also helps with confidence. So that's what I'm kind of more attracted to. To your point, I guess it's an idealized version of myself, or at least mirrors
Hmm.
what I'm after.
Sure. I'm fascinated by this, and in some ways it's um, more generally it's kind of question of human nature, right? Like if you could do anything you wanted with no consequences, the there are a couple ways of looking at that, right? The traditional view, and um, part of this really becomes theological, which we'll avoid the implications of that. But if you could do anything you wanted to, everything you wanted to, always had your way, um, sort of a traditional Western view tends to say, well, that would be bad because ultimately you would do bad things that hurt other people, um, and that your way is always forced upon others. But um, again, regardless of those theological implications, I think that human beings are more complex. I think that if we could have our way in all things without consequence, I think some folk would do great good. They would do tremendous amount of good, right? And truly make the world a better place. And I think part of the reason that there are three wishes, that a genie gives three wishes, is because our instinct tends to be to wish for something good for ourselves. Like, I wish I didn't have to, you know, worry about how to pay the rent or whatever. I wish I were financially stable, or, well, I was rich. Well, but that's answering the question of financial stability. But then we start saying, well, I want others to be okay too, so I'll also wish for world peace, right? And then the third one is, I think, less universal, because we're all different, our personalities and our wants and our desires. And so the third wish is very individualized, you know, um, whether it's, whatever it is. I want to live forever. Um, I want,
Darius once told me one of his wishes would be to be a master violinist.
sure. Yeah,
Like
absolutely.
that's top three.
Yeah. So I
Beautiful
think there's
instrument.
there's something about human nature there. Um, and we talk about D&D as a way to improve, or at least explore, social skills and problem resolution and those sorts of things. And I think this is one of those areas that it comes into play. I think it's on my mind a lot because last week I ran games for high schoolers all week, for a school in California that has their every year they do they split into groups and they have special activities for the week. And the group that I was involved with, about 20 kids, played D&D all week as part of their school curriculum. And I ran a group of four high schoolers, and of course they had, as part of their assignment, to analyze, um, in a positive way, like the social interactions, the problem solving, but then also the school also said, well, let's make it also a liberal arts. So let's talk about narrative and how did your character develop over the course of the week, character development, that sort of thing. But character development, I think, sort of runs from this too. Like, do you guys find that either the characters that you play, or your players as a DM, do you think characters evolve much or develop during the course of a campaign? Do you see that much?
I don't know if I see it a ton. I think an easy way to sort of build a character is to, or at least a backstory for a character is, you have some problem that maybe they're not fleeing from it. There are some, like, there's backstories outside of the tragic kind, but there's always like some sort of goal. I know in Tony's campaign, like my artificer started, like he was like a restaurateur and he like wanted to scour and find like the best ingredients to build up this restaurant. And I feel like over the course of it, like whether the circumstances of the adventure we're running or like myself kind of abandoning it, like other things naturally occur. So I think they're, like in the adventure. So I think there's a natural, not disregard, but other priorities kind of take shape, and that shapes the character as well. I think in some instances, you certainly don't have to abandon a goal like that, and not even abandon, but there's this realization of, oh, there are more important things. Like in the mind of this character, maybe it's like, I'm not really focused on, sourcing the best dairy products at the moment, but because of I want to ensure that there's this great experience for everybody. I think there's like through lines that a character can become more actualized into their surroundings as opposed to, these small goals that they have.
Yeah, yeah. I think my characters. I hate to say it, but I think so often they are one dimensional, right? There isn't a whole lot of development necessarily for me as a player. Shout out to Joe, who usually watches the stream. Joe, I will say, in my Wednesday afternoon game, amazing player, and his character, it's his first D&D campaign. So first of all, and Joe, we were at third level, but he wanted to start at first level because it was his first campaign. He played an introductory session or two here and there, and he's the innkeeper's son, who winds up, being sort of recruited by these band of adventurers and going off to travel and all that. And so we are, I don't know, 16th level now or so. And Joe, Jorik, the character, Jorik, the innkeeper's son, is now went from innkeeper's son to Jorik, hero of the arenas, because in the setting that I run, the shared world setting, arenas are a big thing, right? People fight sort of gladiatorial combat on the regular, and they have, it's like professional sports, really. People bet on it and gain renown and all this sort of thing. And so he went from the innkeeper's son to Jorik, the champion of the arena, to Jorik, the head of the Queen's Guard now. And not just in his roles, but as his roles have changed, his character has matured, and and I love it because Jorik is a character that could have, based on the things that have occurred, become very jaded and angry and less heroic. But in this case, he's become just more and more heroic as time has gone. It's been fun to watch. Those players, in my experience, those characters that have that kind of strong development over the course of the campaign are few and far between, and they're not something I'm good at. I think a background in theater probably would help too, because or perhaps in literature, if you're a writer, someone who's into writing fiction, is already, this idea of character development is on their minds to begin with.
Yeah, I think a key thing also is open communication between like players and DMs. Like if in sort of the instance you're describing, like if there are beats that you're interested in exploring with your character, based on either the surroundings or what's happened thus far in the adventure, like ensuring that there is some sort of opportunity to expand on it, right? Because I think, best laid plans, like, but if such a scenario never arises, like I'm really shoehorning and that feels unnatural, so I'm just going to stay in the backseat. So I mean, like many things and like many topics you've already discussed on the series, like always, I think open communication is a good idea, but especially when you feel stagnant or question or want opportunities to make more choices, and it's not just, here's bandits, stop them, here's bandits, stop them. Mm-hmm. I think putting interesting or tough decisions, or maybe even decisions that retroactively the team or individuals will have to reflect on, like as things unfold, so it can still be a little bit of a mystery. But I think pacing is like a big thing to be able to feel like you're progressing in this character development, not just sort of level milestones.
Yeah,
you're not
wrong there.
To the point of communication and also character development, something interesting I've seen that was not obvious at the beginning was that the DM kind of has a role in character development. So, for example, and it may not match. So like Darius's character had a rival whom he intended to be an intellectual rival, but I sort of inadvertently turned this into a rival that was trying to kill him. And he was like, whoa. And that has happened when so then I'm trying to backpedal a little bit. And that has happened when I've been a player too, where, my characters tend to grow increasingly chaotic. And that's just because I, as a player, kind of get bored. And I'm like, well, let's just burn the house down. Let's just jump in.
I hear you say that, Tony. I'm a little bit worried about our Thursday night game. Zazasas, and for those of you who are listening at home, tune in Thursday night, and you can You can see Tony in full action. Um, Zizasis is chaotic enough to start with. I can't. I'm worried about the idea of him going more chaotic.
Yeah, he's neutral evil, but I guess on the edge. Uh, but he doesn't just want chaos, he wants to rule. So that's
Right.
keeping him away from chaotic a little bit. But some of my other characters, the DM just sort of threw me the Wand of Orcus, and I'm like, this is great. I'm like looking at the stats. I'm like, this wow. And I'm all excited to use it. But then the DM has this idea that he's going to put me on a sort of Anakin Skywalker like path to Darth Vader. And I'm like, that I don't want to lose control of my character because what I said before, like I want options and I want a way out, and I certainly don't want to lose agency. That's the opposite of what I want. So like talking with the DM, I'm like, I don't think I can use this if you're gonna make me all like a paladin of Orcus or whatever your plan for this is. And even Sasasas got exposure to lycanthropy. And then Bob and I had a conversation about like, man, I'd love that magic the resistance to bludgeoning. And it's like, well, your character might occasionally like do stuff in the night. I'm like, I don't really want, I don't
Right.
really want that. Uh, so yeah, so I brought this up to say sort of the character arc can be a collaboration between the DM and the player, and even an accidental, misinterpretation of what the what the player has in mind.
Sure. Sure. You guys are new enough to the game, right? I mean, if I heard you right, I know Tony, you've been playing just for a few years, and Darius, if I heard you right, maybe 6 years or so, give or take. Is that what I heard?
Yep. Yeah. All 5e.
So it's funny because there's discussion going on among what they call the OSR, old school Renaissance folks, and by and large, the OSR is a tribute or a reworking of pre-modern D&D, prior to third edition. Um, and there are a number of different OSR systems and whatnot. But one of the things that the OSR movement I think is trying to recapture is playstyle. And one of the noticeable and marked differences in tone or between editions has been the tone of the DM. So pre-modern D&D and would tell you that the dungeon master is in absolute control. Period. Whatever the DM says goes. It just is. Doesn't mean now the DM is supposed to be a benevolent patriarch and listen to the supplications of his players. But ultimately, we know that the dungeon master knows best, and whatever he decides, and I'm intentionally, because there's a whole misanthropic gender-based thing that goes into it too. But I'm intentionally whatever he decides goes. Um, and this kind of dialogue that you're talking about between player and DM about characters and character development and whatnot is is has sort of had to grow over the last 20 years or so of the game. Fourth edition was the first edition of D&D that didn't include Rule Zero, which is the DM is always right. And fifth edition has moved further away from that as well. I've said before, matter of fact, I put out a video, just a DM Thoughts video a couple weeks ago, and one of the things I propose is a new Rule Zero, and the new Rule Zero should be, don't be a dick, right? It's a collaborative game. It's meant to be collaborative. And you guys coming from theater, like, if you're doing an improv, you can't on a personal level um, be antagonistic toward one of the other players, right? I mean, I'm guessing. I've not done a ton of improv, but I'm going to assume that if you're just sort of you hate the person that you're interacting with, it's not going to make for good improv theater. Um, am I off base there? You think?
No, and we actually in our group we had a little tradition where the last performance there would be a few jokes, a few pranks during the show, which I think some people thought I took too far, uh, to the point of somewhat being disruptive, and I guess it made me consider that, like, oh yeah, some people might not appreciate being thrown off that much. Um, I think my stuff was very funny. It got a lot of laughs, but it's not great when the other actors laugh and break character.
Sure.
Darius once bit his lip so much he started bleeding.
Yep, I had to keep it together. I was never opposed to any of Tony's antics, but they were rarely at like my expense.
Sure.
Um, but yeah, I mean, it's kind of what you were alluding to, like yes and right. If there's something a player wants to do that's maybe going really against the DM, or if I'm in the DM in this position, like I'll try to make that as feasible as possible. If it's something crazy, like yeah, but it sounds interesting, or it's something clearly that this player is invested in trying or doing. Like, let's see where it snowballs. Like, I think inherently, um, it's like a war game, but it's like a role playing game. So like there is that uh, part of agreeing and letting the player maybe in some of those instances dictate the direction, and the DM you're just a little bit more on your toes. Like, all right, I'll open the window a little bit more or leave the doors unlocked. You can push through if you want, and then I think allowing some freedom to see how things go. And yeah, like put things behind checks if they're like crazy, but then also allow. I think you'd kind of gone on before, like uh, I try if there's certain checks that would make sense, but your character's not proficient in them, like use a check that you can justify to me that would be to your advantage, and then yeah, just use that instead. I think like small things like that keep the ball rolling and don't stop the momentum of the role playing aspect of the game.
I think ruling in favor of the player is generally fine, but for me as a player, if you break the rules and it's not in my favor, I get like really, really upset. To the point where even if you break the rules in my favor, like rules is written, you can't use a bonus action cantrip and an action spell. And Bob was like, that's fine. But I won't do it because it just bothers me so much. Like, okay, you let other people do it, but that's fine. Uh, and and then rarely it actually will bother me when the DM rules in other players' favor when it impacts me. So like I had a DM who the gnome asked if they could squeeze by the line of bugbears, and the DM was like, sure. And I'm like, whoa, you need to be two sizes smaller than them, and you're small and they're medium. And then if you're just allowing that, you're undermining the halfling ability that allows people to do that. So now you're like breaking down this ability, and so
Right.
it
And
sort
and
of
it's and
spirals
it's
like,
and it's chaos. It becomes chaos. It's anarchy, and next thing you know, we have cats and dogs living together, and it's. I hear you. I feel you, Tony.
well, because like if we're allowed to do that, I would have like, exploited this other character's ability. I'm like, I didn't know that you're going to allow that.
Sure.
But that sort of thing is rare. Generally, if the DM rules in favor of player, I mean, it benefits everyone. Um, but and I think I'm in the minority, but generally, I want a sort of strict, not just interpretation of the rules. You can bend the rules, but as long as it's well known, as long as
Sure.
I know what's going to happen. I want to, as a player, know what's going to happen, save for the stochastic nature of the randomness of the result, um, and the fact that I might not know what a monster's ability is or whatever. But I was just telling another DM how grateful I was that once the monster uses its ability, he tells us the mechanics of the ability. And I'm like, that's great because if I'm every round not knowing where this darkness came from or how to fight it, I'm like, what do you mean the darkness suppresses my magic items? That's not a thing. But if it's made clear, like, oh
Mhm.
no, when this layer action happens, specifically those magic items turn off. I'm like, okay, I can work around that.
I think
That
yeah.
was just a mention as a player, and maybe some players feel the same way as I do because I thought of this when you mentioned in past editions the DM is God, and then it's like, well, why am I here if the
Right.
DM is just going to say what happens? I want to say, I want to confidently impact things in the way that I expect.
Player agency is what is what we refer to it. We talk about player agency, and it goes in a lot of ways. It hits in regard to storylines, the idea that your choices make a difference, but also it hits in exactly what you're talking about. The At the end of the day, it's a game, and so with games you have rules, and you know you can play D&D however you want to play. If you want a house list of house rules, you want to have house rules a list a mile long, you can do that, but it's only fair to provide that to your players as well. I will say I will take sort of one exception, at least philosophically as a DM from my perspective, and that is this: opponents, creatures that you faced, NPCs of whatever sort, um, don't always have to obey the stat block they're given. The DM can build a version of a creature that is different than the one in the monster manual at will, willy nilly. I think a good DM determines what those differences are ahead of time, and it's something as simple as the archmage, um, as written, having different spells, but it can be also something much more complex, such as maybe this species of drow has a specific version of darkness that does douse the light from magical weapons. And I have no issue with what you're describing, which is the DM makes that clear to the players that this is an exception, and here's why. This particular drow people, they've evolved such that their innate darkness spell is different. You know, it's Menzo darkness or something. It's not the traditional just darkness spell. So I,
And
I
if I
would
get
say,
the idea as a player that you developed that ahead of time, I'm a lot more, oh, okay,
yeah,
okay. If you do that, and I can tell,
yeah,
if you do that as a response to the way the battle's going, and I'm like, well, actually, that ability doesn't work,
right,
then I feel punished,
yeah.
and that's not nice.
That's not yeah. Don't be a dick, right? I mean, no, I sure. And like for example, I mean, we've talked about before, like adjusting things on in combat on the fly. For example, uh, I will if I find a creature's being killed entirely too easily, I'll give him regen to try and just tip the scales a little bit. I won't tell the players that it's regenning. I won't describe it that way. And is it fiddling? Yeah, um, but it's really tweaking a combat, right? And sometimes that's just in response to the swinginess of the system. I mean, my high schoolers took down at fifth level, four of them took down an adult red dragon in 2 rounds. 2 rounds.
At
And,
fifth level.
yeah, at fifth level. And shout out to those kids. I mean, they really mastered the game pretty quickly, but it also had a lot to do with a bunch of made saving throws and really low damage rolls on breath weapon, and some of those more swingy aspects of the game.
You remember the party composition? Not for
There
barbarians.
was no rogue. Let's see. They had two sorcerers and a druid and
'Cause a lucky
paladin.
breath weapon can
Paladin.
TPK that whole party like
Oh
in
yeah.
one.
No, I know. I was. I mean, I'm like I'm ready early on, and we weren't using a we were using Owlbear Rodeo, which is a great sort of lightweight virtual tape, and not even really a virtual tabletop. It's just a way to share maps, but it does have fog of war and lets people move their tokens. Because I didn't want the overhead of training them on a VTT, so like my rolls were in secret basically, and so like if I roll too high on breath weapon in that first round, I'm going to modify the damage down for them because I don't want them to die immediately. Well, it turns out I had no reason to worry about them dying immediately, and I was going to roll piss poor damage anyway.
And to the point of editing the monster stat block, I definitely did that, and I told my players after the fact that the Dragon of Icespire Peak introductory adventure, I mean, minor spoiler, it climaxes in fighting the dragon
Right.
of Icespire Peak. And so I kind of thought that they would dispatch that dragon a little bit too easily. And I didn't make it a full-on adult white dragon, but I did make a sort of adolescent white dragon. So I sort of pulled abilities and did the HP sort of halfway to the adult. And I also added layer actions, and I added
the ice methods.
And I added ice methods, which
I thought worst. Oh my gosh.
I thought went really well with the dragon blind sight, and the ice methods put out a fog cloud.
It was the worst. So, by saying it was the worst, I mean it was the best. It was like a very good combative annoyance that we had to overcome.
So you were in that group because Tony's talked about that encounter before.
Yeah, it was great. I mean, I'm not the cleric, but I just stayed behind, shooting healing words off, and then once everything's sort of dealt with, I traipse into the fray.
And then and Darius's character was the last one alive. Everybody else was unconscious or dead. Was anyone dead? Methodist must have been dead.
Methodist was dead, and I think it was actually a question I would have died the next turn, but that's like an open communication during combat, talking through the negotiations of like booming blade. I think like, would this dragon fly away? Would it know that this effect is on it? Like that's kind of talking through, and then you justify like, yeah, it's confident it would just like leave you in the dust.
Yeah, I as the DM sort of had to make a call. I knew that this dragon was under the effect of booming blade, and it would die if it moved, or very likely die if it moved. And so the question is, would the dragon know that? Because the DM certainly knows that, and if I were playing optimally as the DM, I wouldn't move. But I looked at what the dragon had been doing, which is like flying up into the air and doing the breath weapon from above and not just staying on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
And I also looked at its, intelligence. I'm like, it doesn't have any spell casting. It hasn't had any exposure to spell casting. The player's handbook says that a creature is generally aware that it's under the effect of a spell, but it doesn't necessarily mean it knows what that spell does. So I'd say, all right, he knew he was under the effect of a spell, but who knew that it would kill him when he moved?
I think I find myself in that situation frequently, and maybe not frequently, but from time to time. Trying to decide if the NPC, if the monster or whatever it is, would be their tactical decisions, right, in relation to whatever the players have going on, spells that are affecting them and whatnot. And so what I often will do when I'm asking myself, would they know about booming blade? Wouldn't they? I'll just give the creature a wisdom saving throw, and I'll usually do a middling DC, like a DC 15. And I'll say, all right, well, whatever reason in his past, he's seen someone cast booming blade, or he's heard, whatever reason, right? You can certainly after the fact, if there's a success, determine what that reason could have been. But I'll give him a roll, and in doing so, I release responsibility for being over tactical as the DM. But there's a sense...
because you don't want to go too far the other way, where the players feel like you're giving them a gimme, and then you sort of take away the satisfaction of having won the battle.
Sure. And, different strokes, different folks, DMs operate differently. Like, I'm gonna put out something there that I'm going to suggest probably applies to a majority of DMs. It probably doesn't apply as much like to Tony in the way that the way that your DM prep works. But like as a DM, I'm running as a player, right? You have the same character every week, and when they gain a new ability, usually you have at least a couple of sessions to get used to it before you level again. And so you're intimately familiar with your character, and you have lots of time and bandwidth to think about how they operate tactically. As a DM, you're running different creatures and different NPCs every session, and during your prep time, you have to make a decision. How much time do I want to spend focusing on understanding the tactical capabilities of this creature, especially if it's a complex creature? And at some point, there's a point of diminishing returns where you're better off spending to that time on other elements, on story or other types of development, rather than just mastering the tactical aspects of creature X. And I think a lot of DMs anyway would relate to that. And so I feel like optimizing their tactics really is during the process of combat is really only fair, because I'm not playing them every week. I don't have that intimate familiarity. Now, Tony, do you spend a lot of time, and Darius too? What's your prep like when you look at a particular creature? How much time do you spend sort of considering pocket cases and tactics?
An inordinate amount of time.
Yeah.
I'm just like right now, instead of various other obligations I have, I'm like, for a variety of reasons, if anyone's watching, I've been spending a lot of time prepping this, just this system, which, I mean, you may know I love Foundry.
Yeah.
And I have this dream where just everything is automated. And I was showing Darius some stuff the other day where like you cast Misty Step and it says like, okay, where do you want to go? And then you just click the point where you want to go. It shows your radius of everywhere you can go. You click the point and it shows it like a poof and a poof. And then it doesn't actually use your movement. It still says you have remaining movement. And it says you cast a spell as a bonus action, and then if you try to cast another spell as a bonus action, it'll say you already used your bonus action, you're done. So as part of that, I open up the enemy stat block, and then I'm testing every ability. I'm like, okay, this giant spider, when it bites, does it do the con save afterward? Does it apply the poison damage? Does it apply the effect if they're stunned or whatever? In that process, I sort of get a sense for how to use them optimally. I almost TPK'd the party with a bunch of giant spiders. Remember that in Axelm? It was.
Yep. There were 2 times as many spiders as us. And I think at the moment, I still technically may be the only character who can cast any sort of healing spell. We have another party member who can use healing kits, but
yeah, another party had the healer feat, which is underrated. And she wasn't present for one of the sessions, so you were in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.
So Darius, when you're prepping a session, what kind of minutia do you how much time or effort do you spend on sort of that question, the tactical question?
I think it's, and I've like written before creatively or just personally for myself, so like I always like have that idea in my head, like writing a book, like I know how I want this chapter to end or this page, like what's that cliffhanger. So like I think I generally know in a session going into it, not to railroad anybody certainly, but like I have like beats in mind, like throughout this like arc, like where they're in this, we're doing Witchlight right now, so like they're in Hither, so like I know like the big important beats that I want to happen, whether they're actually in the campaign or I'm adapting them through myself, etc. So like I spend more time kind of thinking on the rationale for what I'm inserting or changing in the campaign, particularly because, in the module, I think as you had said in the last episode, like you pretty much don't have to fight at all in this entire
It's possible,
adventure.
I'm told, to go through all of Witchlight without a combat.
Yeah. So I spend a lot of time on like trying to connect the dots and weave enough of an interesting story while injecting a lot of interesting relevant combat opportunities that aren't just added in on mixed success rate. And then kind of what you were saying before, like I don't necessarily spend a lot of time on the creatures. Like I know like, all right, here's sort of at the outset, like going into hither in this part of the Prismere, like I know like the short list of creatures that they would encounter are like A through H, but like I want them a little bit varied. So like I'll do some amalgamation of like things that I think are complementary. So like I'll kind of just mush some abilities onto like another creature
Mhm.
from somebody else. So like all of these monsters I'm having or I'm like creating do exist, but then I'm giving them, you know, this single feature or effect or this minor spell casting list to make them a little bit more interesting or difficult. Again, this is like first time running through a full adventure, so and it's the first realm, but I think most of my time spent prepping is sort of the rationale, like why is this happening? And it may not be clicking yet because Tony's in this campaign, like the whys may not be being answered, but like I have this like full story that I'm like writing out, layering on top of the adventure that gradually will unfold. Maybe too gradually, maybe too fast in some spots, but that's where a lot of the time I think I spend on is.
Yeah, no, I think that's a pretty common approach. I do have an advantage in terms of tactically running creatures. One of the advantages I have is because I mean I DM a standard week is 28 to 35 hours of DMing, and you know I unashamedly reuse material right from one group to the next, as long as there aren't overlapping players. You know, I have no problem taking an encounter and adapting it for two different groups. You know, that's just in my mind just efficiency. So I have that benefit where I know a lot of DMs, if you're running a single campaign or maybe even two, those opportunities are fewer and farther between. I think this all ties in something so to some degree to this. We talk about metagaming, and we talk about like, I'll have a player that'll say, well, my character's not very wise, so I don't think he would actually be able to solve this puzzle. Or my character's not very smart, so he wouldn't know this or that. But I think, um, there's a sense on the player side, on the player group side, in which you might have the elf wizard that has an 18 intelligence, right? The player, if he had an intelligence score, might be a 10 or a 12. And whereas the person playing the barbarian with the 8 intelligence, that player, if he had a score, might be a 14 or 15. And so there's a sense in which, as the players collaborate out of character, I feel like it's not really metagaming as much as it is um, helping to simulate those differences in ability, particularly wisdom and intelligence. Those seem to be the ones that are more nebulous than like strength, right? Strength is it just is what it is. As a player, I don't have to do anything to prove my character's strength. But sometimes if I'm trying to solve a puzzle, I've got to prove his wisdom or his intelligence or charisma-based stuff is another one. If I'm trying to convince the town guard, I've still got to talk to the DM and give him some sort of rationale. And the better my rationale, the more likely I am to get advantage. The DM's likely to give me advantage on the roll, for example. So, I feel like other players stepping in out of character to help each other, I feel like really is part of the system and really makes sense in game. Whereas a lot of folks would say, well, no, you have to be quiet. You don't see the puzzle, right? You're in a different room. You can't contribute to this. You're not part of the conversation. You're not there. Don't give advice to the player. And, I think sometimes that can be a mistake. Um, it takes away from the simulation aspect, I suppose. But how important is simulation? Again, some of those old school Renaissance folks would say it's the most important thing. But I don't. It's still a game at the end of the day, right?
Yeah, and if the player's character would know something that the player doesn't, I, as the DM, have no bones about saying your character would know that, and it doesn't feel like a gimme because
Right.
your character would know, or I might remind them of something the character encountered. even if they don't have the keen mind feat, you know, I might throw them something. And then if it's the opposite, if the player knows something that the character wouldn't, I never have a problem sort of fitting in, sort of like twisting it, like how how might the character know this? The character might have an established friend who would know this, and they would have encountered this before, or something like that. I never have an issue, and I don't understand. I mean, maybe it's a little ignorant of me to say I don't understand, but rather I encourage other DMs to um, just sort of adapt to these situations. Like, you can do whatever you want to do. If the player wants to do something, I can always find a way how they can do that by the book with their abilities. And one of my favorite things is when a player is sort of new to D&D and they just describe the type of character they want to play. I can pump out a character sheet that is super good, that is exactly in line with what they wanted to play. Which I think Darius can back up with the way I built Mephitis and Theodosia and Dihedral.
Yeah, for sure. Tony, I think we've talked about this before. I think it's like never a good idea to close off an entire function of the game from people. So like if I actually had run into this similar situation, I'm playing in an adventure and I was like, well, my character's intelligence isn't that great, but like I'm good at puzzles. So like I don't know if I should speak up, but like no, you're still collaborative. Like that's so what? I'm just gonna like twiddle my thumbs for like the next couple sessions while we're like traipsing through this maze. Similarly, in like conversations, like I know you talked about, and it's like in the rules, like use strength for intimidation instead of charisma. Like there's ways to still be involved in these, and if it's not apparent, like that's either in a conversation with the player or the DM, or the DM to like invite some sort of opportunity for players that makes sense to engage in, whether it's combat, conversations, puzzles, whatever it may be.
Some of this goes back to the old history of the game again, and it's funny that we're talking a lot about that today for whatever reason. I was just looking to see if I have my first edition DM's guide on the shelf back here, and it's apparently still packed away. But in the first few pages of the DM's guide in pre-modern D&D, it says if you're a player, don't read this. You should not know what's in here. And the monster manual's the same way. And I remember being a kid, and the idea when I was playing in my teens and even into my early 20s, if I wouldn't let the players look at my copy of the monster manual, and when a player would buy one, I would get. I mean, I wouldn't kick them out of the game, but I'd be like, no, why are you doing that? You're not supposed to know that stuff. That belong me. That not belong you. And yeah, it's a very different mindset, I think. This idea that players should be cut off from a significant portion of the game because,
Yeah.
for whatever reason, right?
You know, Darius just reminded me of it's one of the things we talk about, because you know how I love a wizard with options. In Darius's campaign, I'm playing a barbarian who doesn't have a lot of options between Smash. And so, I'm like, ooh, it says in the rules that I can use strength for intimidation, and then I can at least contribute that way. But I've also had conversations with Bob about, my character would invest in intimidation. I, as a player, could invest in persuasion just as easily. And so, how do you feel about, in my impression is that persuasion is more effective and has like no drawbacks. If you fail the persuasion check, meh. If you fail the intimidation check, you get in trouble. And for whatever reason, the intimidation DC tends to be higher.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I mean, if we're gonna play that game, I'll invest in persuasion. Like if every time we go into town the discount is based on a persuasion check, I'll invest in persuasion and not intimidation, because I get the feeling as a player that if I play the intimidation card, the merchant will like come back and be mad at me or like, make things more expensive. Uh, so like that's I think a conversation to be had about um it never makes sense to me how like the wizard is more proficient in religion than the cleric. That's that doesn't make any sense to me because
Sure.
religion is intelligence. So if I were a cleric, I'd be like, can I apply my proficiency in religion to wisdom, please?
No, that makes a lot of sense. It does. It does. And I think some of it, in talking about intimidation versus persuasion, some of that's social conditioning, right? I mean, we want to believe the old
Mhm.
axioms. You get more flies with honey. No, you get if you have honey and shit, you get flies. You get more. How is it? You get more
It
uh,
involves honey and vinegar.
and
I
bears and
I
vinegar.
think
I
it's
don't know.
flies.
Catch more bees with honey? I don't know.
Yeah, there you go. You catch more bees with honey than with vinegar. You understand the idea, right? I mean, we that's social conditioning. That's what we're taught to believe, that being nicer to people will get you better results than being forceful with them. But then there's a whole sub segment of the population too that thinks, well, that's garbage, and being nice is um, is a sign of weakness, and that only the strong survive, and so you get what you want by being assertive. So, these aren't just questions about a gaming rule set, right?
Yeah, it ends up being
I mean,
mechanics. Like
well,
I
it's not even
know
just it's about who we are as human beings, and even
I
even the.
know
Go ahead, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I think in Fable, if you want a merchant discount, you can be either super good or super evil. It works both ways. It's if you're middling, then
Yeah,
you pay the full price. And I think that applies in Gloomhaven too, where if you can sort of get your discounts through intimidation. Uh, and there's no drawbacks. I think there was some sort of drawback in Fable. It was something unrelated that if you're evil, you don't get this.
You can like
But you
grow
do get
devil
access
horns
to
or
the
something. I
dungeon.
don't know.
I think there are other real world
Yeah.
applications of that too, and even talking about like what you say with wisdom and intelligence, like. Um, Little known fact, I went to college originally to become a minister. And, I'm a little bit, and I even spent a year in seminary. And a little known fact, religion professors, the degree to which they're a good religion professor has almost nothing to do with how devout they are. Because, I mean, I'll be honest, a Harvard trained doctor of theology just knows more about theology than a devoted uh,
Priest.
person who works among other underprivileged youth. Now, which of those is a better person? Which of those is more valuable to society? Those are other questions, right? And that we also answer somewhat in D&D. But in terms of where you're talking about wisdom and intelligence for the religion skill, I'm not sure I agree. I mean, it depends on the application, right? I mean, if your religion check is because you want to know something about a deity, I think intelligence is still the right skill. And I think I know lots of pastors that really don't know nearly as much about theology as they ought to. Um, so I think intelligence might be the right skill. And I think there are other ways that plays out too.
Religion, just because you're intelligent doesn't mean you're intelligent about everything. And
No,
someone who's super religious might be intelligent about this area.
which is why they're
Like,
proficient.
yeah.
Which is why they're proficient. But their base calculation still relates to their innate intelligence. And if you're just talking about knowledge, the things that they recall, that they remember, in D&D, that's all. That's intelligence. That's not wisdom. Wisdom's application. So no, I hear you. I hear what you're saying, and
I just something bothers me about the wizard always having a higher arcana or religion check than the cleric.
Yeah, I mean, the idea of specialized knowledge, right? Like I did my master's in history, and so you want to ask me about military academies and social mobility, class mobility in the antebellum South. I'm your guy. You want to ask me about whether General so and so did the right thing in World War II? I got no fucking clue. Not even a little bit. So I mean,
From
there's specialization too as a thing.
so like metagaming a little bit, I'm building my wizard and I'm choosing my proficiencies. I'm going to be proficient in every intelligence skill, and
Yeah,
I am. So my wizard has a +10 to religion checks, which sort of blows the cleric out of the water.
yeah, and but if you're choosing a proficiency, that means you're assuming that at some point you've studied it, and history would be the same, right? Or any of the intelligence. If you're choosing proficiency, it would, and it's an intelligence skill, it means that you're studied in it. Or if it's a non-intelligence skill, it means you're practiced in it in some way or another. Acrobatics, yeah, you're proficient in acrobatics, not just because you're innately dexterous, but because you've spent at least some point honing that skill in whatever way it is. No, it's not a perfect system by any means. I don't disagree with that.
I love my +15 to Arcana though. Makes me
Right?
feel great.
So there's a question. All right, talk to me about how you guys, both of you guys, how you, because Arcana is one of those things that didn't exist in pre-modern D&D as a check, and it's in some ways it's nebulous. It's not just magical knowledge. It can be other things. So like there's sometimes an overlap between like Arcana and detect magic. Should that be a clearer line as far as what they do? Let me know if I'm not terribly clear on what I'm saying there.
Well, what I tend to do is uh so say you're what classes can learn detect magic? It's not just wizards. Oh, ton.
Bard, sorcerer, some clerics, I think.
uh
Yeah.
so if you're a sorcerer and you know detect magic, which a lot of them do, um, then if you're trying to know something about detect magic or know that if you know there's a detect magic spell present, I would let you use your charisma instead of your intelligence,
Right.
and also apply your arcana proficiency if you have it. Because it's your spell casting. You have a question about spells. This is how you experience spells, is through your charisma. And likewise, the cleric experiences spells through wisdom. So to say that um, all of your knowledge about spells is based on intelligence, not really.
No,
And
that
it's not
makes sense.
fair.
I think
Well,
I
go ahead.
think overall, like just hearing it talked about, it feels like inevitably there's some sort of switching or reconfiguring of the way checks and proficiencies are kind of laid out. And there's kind of like, ability score modifiers. It's like whatever your character is good at. It's like there's this well of, well, how are you good at your skills? And then you can swap and leverage different ability scores for those sets of skills. It feels to me like there's something maybe that there's room down the line for to be published that makes it more official. Maybe it is. I know like the charisma and strength swap exists, but like kind of what Tony was just talking through, like how you go about learning these spells or how to read them impacts what your skills actually are. Like there's more fluidity, more options, and more customization. As much a pain that would be because it's a long list of skills to keep track of, but
I think there are other game systems that sort of innately do this, and D&D with fifth edition is the first time that they said, hey, you can use strength for intimidation. This is a new concept, whereas prior it was always just your charisma no matter what. There are a couple others. I want to say that Savage Worlds and or Vampire. The not Mind's Eye Theater, World of Darkness. I want to say those two systems have something similar where when you're going to make a skill check, you pick something from your, what would be the D&D equivalent of abilities, and then you pick something from what would be the D&D equivalent of skills, and you say, here's why they work together, and now I'm going to make this roll. And though that's the standard way of doing it, there are some cases that are like, okay, if you're going to shoot a gun, it's always dexterity and shooting or pistol, whatever the skill is, right? But those cases are fewer and farther between that are predefined. Most of the time, it's pick an ability, pick a skill, and tell the game master why those two should work together in this situation. I don't know if I like the idea that it's usually that way. I still like the idea of it being an exception, though. I think.
There's always a conversation that happens around counterspell. I find like the DM will say, "I'm casting a spell," which is sort of like an invitation to cast counterspell. Whereas the player will say, "I'm casting a spell," and the DM will be like, "What spell?" I'm like, "You don't know." And so it always ends up sort of being, like if it's a spell and especially if it's a spell you have prepared, I'll generally say to the player like they're casting this spell and the spell well. And then if it's I'll adjust it so if it's a spell you've been that's on your spell list, then you do have to roll, but it's like a little bit of a low DC. If it's a spell you've seen an enemy cast before, it's a little bit of a higher DC. And then if it's a spell you've had no exposure to whatsoever, you don't know what spell it is. And likewise, and the players also want to know, well, what slot is it being cast at?
See, that's an interesting house rule there, Tony, because rules as written, identifying a spell being cast is a reaction. So you can identify it, but you can never counter it. Rules as written, if you identify it. So I'd like to announce to everyone that we've identified at least one house rule.
I mean,
that Tony
can you source that? Because if so, I'll change the way I run it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, I don't want you to change. I like what you're saying. I like that idea. Don't get me wrong. I'm not critiquing it. I'm just saying rules as written. I'll look it up later on. I don't do it during the show, but
yeah, I'm loath to go against rules as written. If I'm defining the rules, I'll change it. You don't know what spell that is anymore.
Yeah, I like that idea. I like the idea of what you're proposing, though. I do, to some degree. But I think anything that slows, because now, when I look at the spell, I've got to cross-reference it with the list of players' spells, whatever the criteria is, whether it's the ones they have prepped, whether it's the ones that are on their spell list, whatever it is. Now, when I, as a DM, my creature casts a spell, that's something else to slow down combat. And one of the beautiful things about 5th edition is the streamlining. So I'm loath to add those in. I suppose at player request, then, if I as DM try to, if I'm going to counter a spell, if an NPC is going to counter a spell, I try to get that out there before the player says what it is. But it truly is on the player to pause long enough to give the DM opportunity to counterspell. Just as DM, I try to do the same. And if I say, okay, he's going to cast lightning bolt, that's my goof. Players should use that knowledge. If they would normally counterspell lightning bolt, players are going to, and rightly so, use that knowledge. It's on me, just as it's on the player to give a pause. I don't think as a DM, I typically say, well, what spell is that? Do I want to counterspell? I'll either, if I don't know what it is, if he would counterspell, I'll do it. Now, I'll say that DM knowledge plays in for sure. There are some, I know that some classes, the spell that they cast is not going to be as potentially devastating as other classes. Same thing with some players, right? Eddie, if you're listening, I know when you cast a spell, I'm much more likely to counterspell it than just about anybody else in any of the groups that we're in, because I know it's going to potentially be a big deal. So,
I remember I was sometimes I try to play you a little bit where I bait you into using your reaction, like I did successfully with the necromancer
And that's
fight,
fair. That's fair.
where I'm like, I'm eldritch blasting, hoping you cast shield, which you did, and now you can't counterspell my suggestion,
Yep. No,
which
it's fair game. Fair
made
game.
the enemy walk away.
Yeah, fair game. Absolutely. If I can do it, you can do it. I mean, it's hey, it's a hard world out there. It's us versus them, and yeah.
Yeah, you do it just as, and you're privy to more knowledge because like you as the DM know what I have at my disposal, but I don't know as a player what you have at your disposal.
Yeah. But I think that's balanced out again by the fact that you get to play your character every week,
Hmm.
whereas I only get to play those NPCs periodically. All right. Uh, all right. I'm not really prepped to do world building session this week. Um, so we might wind up cutting a little bit short on the show tonight, today. But what else? What else you guys got in mind? You're both relatively new DMs, and I assume just to hear you talk about one another's DMing, and the little bit that I got to play with Tony as a DM, I think you probably both do a great job. What can I? Is there anything that I, as somebody who's been doing this for 40 years almost, and who does it, you know, 28 to 35 hours a week, and has for the last year? Anything on your minds? Any questions that you have that about making your DMing better, or something that it could be rules related or not, but anything on your minds? No,
Uh,
we don't need to know anything, Bob. We're good.
Derek, so you looked like you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was gonna ask. I know it's a little easier when following a module, but in general, when planning an adventure, and maybe it's just experience and having a finger on the pulse of the group. How often, or is there a process you go through with sort of putting X number of shiny objects along the trail, like that, to deviate a party or to trick them or to just really add, they are all relevant. Sort of how do you juggle plot hooks? Is there really just one that you're trying to pull people across? And once they deviate, then you follow? Do you reel them back in? Do you give them a bunch of things up front?
So there's
What's
a
like
couple of
the
different
best
questions.
approach?
A couple of
Yeah.
different questions there, at least that I'm hearing. Let me answer them in turn. One is related to party progression and sort of how do you keep them on the right path, to some degree. And there's a something called the rule of three. And if you talked about writing fiction, mystery writers, my understanding is this is kind of a core thing for mystery writers. If you want to give a clue to your party, you have to, whatever it is that you're trying to communicate to them, you have to do it 3 times in 3 different ways, for them to notice it, because otherwise they're going to miss it, or they're likely to miss it. And I find that to be true with plot points. Anything that I want the party to follow, three is about the right number. But you're also, I think, asking about when they veer off, when they pick up on a detail that was not meant to be anything important. It could have been an off the hand phrase, or even something misspoken only slightly, and the party
Or a
gloms onto
flowery
that.
description that you
Yeah,
gave of the room.
exactly. Um, I like it when that happens too, because I find that sometimes my players are much better storytellers than I am. And the thing that they're afraid of or imagining in their minds is much more interesting than what I had to begin with. And so you run with it sometimes. The situation I always talk about is the parties traveling through the tundra, and they see something that looks like the signs of a white dragon, right? And immediately, one of the party members decides that, oh no, we're in immediate danger. We need to get out of here. And it was like a corpse that was like months old, But somehow, I mean, I don't remember the details of it, but it was like something about what I said when I described it made him think, oh no, there's a white dragon going to come and get us right now. So they ran to the nearest cave. Now I'm going to say that again. They ran to the nearest cave. So, well, yeah, I guess that's not a bad idea. Why not? Why not have a dragon in the area? And you know, dragons they like to live in caves. And so they run into the nearest cave, and lo and behold, they run into a white dragon's lair. It was not part of the intended adventure at all. It was not even a little bit, right? It was just sort of an off-the-cuff detail. But, you know, it sounded like fun, so I let them explore it, and I gave it to them. Like, all right, you want there to be a dragon, obviously. Boom, there's a dragon. And it wound up being pretty cool. And not only was there a dragon, there was a mom. And not only was there a mom, there was a grandpa dragon, an ancient that chased them further into the cave where the ancient couldn't even fit. And they had to really run.
Dragon.
I know, right? They were 8th level at that point. They should have been able to
at any level, that's
take it if they wanted to at 8th
problem.
Level. Does that kind of answer what you're getting at, Darius?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I was curious if the approach that you generally go with is yes and, as opposed to, right, I said before, I never want to like railroad, even in a module, kind of the decisions of a player, but like how far do you go when you know like, oh, they're like disregarding everything. They want to go to like this whole other town that doesn't really exist. It was just sort of an offhand comment, but like, sure, let's go and see what's there.
I had a group in the 2000s that I had this whole adventure on the Sword Coast planned for them, and they, you know, one of the players, shout out to Greg if you're watching or listening to this after the fact, Greg decided that he wanted to go to Waterdeep, which was not on the radar for the adventure at all, and so they packed up and went to Waterdeep, and I was, you know. That derailed it. That definitely derailed what I had in mind. I had to start over with what I had in mind. The right answer usually, if it's not that major, like we're leaving the region altogether and just going to the big city, the answer usually is some smoke and mirrors. And that is say, well, okay, what have I told them about my plot that I want them to take? And given the information that they know, not what I've prepared everything, but what they know, how can I adjust the trajectory of what I had in mind such that, oh, look, they are going the right way. To put it in its simplest terms, there are 2 towns, one to the east, one to the west. I've encouraged them to go to the west because that's where the MacGuffin is. They either don't know or don't care, and so they go to the east. Well, guess what just happened? On my prep notes, on where it says West Town, I cross out West and I write the word East. Lo and behold, they got to the right place. There's a way of doing that doesn't that you don't tip that hand to the players, where they don't know that you've done that, and that can be a challenge. But
I was playing in the Avernus campaign, which is a pretty good campaign, a little weird and disturbing, but it's a pretty good campaign. But the intro is written, in my opinion, horribly. Like it's not good, and it doesn't lead well into the levels 1 to 3 don't lead well into level 4. And so we got to the point where it's like, okay, can you guys hop in this portal to hell? And we're like, why the hell would we go to hell? We have no incentive to hop down that portal. And then the DM pauses and goes like, well, we could start a new adventure. All right, I guess we're going to hell. Like there's no real way to say you end up in hell when you refuse to go to hell. In terms of that smoke and mirrors thing. So I guess there needs to be a sort of collaboration with
sure.
Can the players justify playing along with what I have prepped?
Part of that as DM is taking the pulse and of the party and listening. I think the best DMs really great storytellers. I think they're great listeners. Um, Listening to where they're at, listening to what their thoughts are. If dropping into the portal of hell is completely not on their radar, then you have to take more time and give them a reason. Yeah, honestly, if they've signed up to play Descent into Avernus, you're like, guys, it's on the title of the fucking module. I'm sorry you didn't have any other warning than that, but there you go, right? As a last resort, you can do that. I would, in theory, I would try to take an extra session or two and give them some more breadcrumbs.
One of the things that I struggle with as a DM that's related is when the players, um, I'm generally prepared with monsters and I'm generally prepared with encounters and I can come up with a decent encounter on the fly. But what I can't come up with, what I really struggle with is like maps on the fly and NPCs on the fly. So the players just invented this tea house and then they want to go to this tea house and I'm like, I don't know. Like, okay, it's theater of the mind right now, and the proprietor is named, and I'm like looking up fantasy name generator, uh, and and so then after the fact, I have to sort of build in the tea master and maybe a magic item the proprietor can give out. And so I guess that's a sort of question. Maybe it stems from experience. You always seem to have a map ready to go.
Yeah, I mean, it's two in my mind very different questions that pose a similar problem for you. One is NPCs and one is locations, and maybe they're a lot more similar than what I'm suggesting. But um, the NPCs are always, again, for me that's 40 years of coming up with NPCs. But I find a helpful trick is, and you guys have been in theater, so especially for you guys, think about a character that maybe one that you've portrayed in theater, or that you've seen portrayed in theater or in movies, and you take that character, and this is now the personality for that NPC. And the names you can always just get off a generator, but in terms of their personality and their motivations, and really having a list of NPC archetypes or NPC personalities, even referencing, okay, this one is Vito Corleone. This one is Tom Hanks in any movie. This, and so on. And then you pull from them as needed, right? And then, of course, make note to yourself so you know who that was the next time they go back. It's not necessarily easy, but it's something that it's a resource that you can build for yourself. Even just make a list of 50 sort of iconic characters from film, theater, movies, whatever, and have that to pull from. And then, but in terms of maps, yeah, that's something I've very methodically in the last year. Part of my preparation time each week, my desk work, is specifically curating battle maps. And so I spend a lot of time on Patreon, and I spend a lot of time looking at the various resources on DM's Guild, and so that I've got maps. And there are still, like a tea house. That's one I would have to take a few minutes and go out and try and find real quick if they wanted to go to a tea house. But yeah, so there's no easy solution to that one. The maps, those are resources that you have to curate. I do have them well organized, right? I have them named by environment, right? So city, snow, swamp, whatever. And then I usually have 2 or 3 other keywords to those maps, because I've got literally hundreds in my maps folder. And so, indexing those and being able to search for those is important.
What about?
I'm going to write down tea house because I need a tea house map.
Yeah, it's like a pub but a little fancier.
Yeah.
And then another thing that I concern myself with a lot related to creating NPCs is creating voices. because a lot of times I've seen a lot of DMs sort of every voice is the same. Darius is very good at making new voices. He has a wide
Like the
range.
only strength. I would say.
But like I know Bob, you do the dwarven voice. You know, you got that down,
All
and
my
then
dwarves, all my dwarves are Scotch Irish. I recognize it.
and then I can do the Spanish voice really well. And then to sauce, I just try to do a little wispier, like I have something in my throat. Uh, yeah, and I guess Hassan Pfeffer, the sort of Harangon I
He's kind of
play,
like
and
Swedish,
he's kind of
German. I
like
can't really tell.
I tried to make him like the merchant in Frozen, like
Yeah.
the yoo-hoo, big summer blowout. Uh, but but
Yeah,
yeah,
characterization is a whole thing, right? I mean, and it's not just voices. I think it's important to move back from thinking in terms of voices to thinking of characterization because and I did an interview about when I was first looking at starting a DM masterclass, and I put together an interview with an actor, a friend of mine. He's one of my good friend's kids, but he's also a friend. He's an actor in he was in the off Broadway production of Friends, the parody musical, and he's been on some other things in New York, but and it's just a wonderful. And eventually, I'm going to get around to editing that and just posting it for one of these Ask the DM sessions, I think. But one of the most important things that I learned from him in that conversation was this idea that it's not just a voice, it's characterization. So you sort of physically think about what that character, what their face looks like when they're speaking, right? And how they hold their body. And so even if you're not in a game where even if you're in an online game where maybe you don't have camera going, the way you hold your body. So if I'm a very sort of aristocratic Thurston Howell the Third, I not only do the corners of my mouth bend in like this, but I probably have my hands doing something very, maybe even my pinkies in the air, even if I'm not lifting a cup at that exact moment, and it helps you sort of get into the character. One of the cool tricks that he taught me was the Wizard of Oz. You guys are in theater. Are you familiar with the Wizard of Oz voice exercises?
the Wizard of Oz voice
Yeah.
exercises.
I don't
So
think so. Maybe if you do them, they'll ring a bell.
it takes you all the way through the register, right? You have, I'm Glinda. I'm the good witch, and I'm here. I'm here because you've killed the bad witch, of course, and oh, you'll need those ruby slippers to go home. And then you've got um, at the bottom, and you have the wizard, and I am the great and powerful Oz down here, down in the deep parts of my chest. And you have others in the mid range. You have the cowardly lion. Put him up. Where they at? I'll take him one at a time. I'll knock them all together. And there's half a dozen. And the wicked witch. I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too. And so you have this whole register. And I've got them way out of order, and I'm missing some there. But you get the general idea, which is why Aaron is the guy on Broadway and I'm not. But you get the idea, right? You move through that whole register just as an exercise. And you pay attention to what your body is doing. When I'm the Oz, I'm looking downward and I'm puffing up my chest. And when I'm Glinda, I'm very light. And yes, my voice is higher pitched, but also I raise my eyebrows and I'm much more expressive in the face. And the Wicked Witch, I definitely have a sneer in everything I do, and the corners of my mouth don't move. I barely move my lips at all. So, doing some of those things, and when you're working on a characterization, a voice, and paying attention to what your body is doing, or when you're looking at inspiration, looking at somebody to play or a movie, and you're watch what their body is doing, and then practice doing that. And again, not just the voice part of it, right? If you're going to do the cowardly lion, it's going to be most effective if you're doing this, right, with your fists. Whereas you can just say, Put him up, put him up. How convincing am I now? Put him up, put him up. Let's get into a fight. So,
I'll be
no,
listening for these voices now in your campaigns.
the one I really want to master is B. Arthur, because like you have this idea that when you do a female voice, it's always supposed to be higher pitched, and to some degree that's true. But B. Arthur was very feminine, very much an iconic female character, but her voice was very deep, and I won't even try to do it because it's so poor. But Erin does a great job on this video, and you'll see. Once I've mastered the B. Arthur, she'll become pretty much any aristocratic female character. That'll become my aristocratic female character voice. So,
I
but
really struggle with female characters. They always end up being like just light and quiet because I don't know what else to do.
yeah, well, and part of that is culture and media, right? Because I mean, strong women characters are fewer and further between. Um, Although I don't know, your wife Haya plays in our Thursday group, and I think you have a strong woman character in real life though too, though that you can maybe think about Haya when you're doing female voices. I don't know.
Yeah, I've thought about using like voice modulators too. I used one at one point and I think it annoyed everybody and I turned it off. But maybe I can make them less annoying if I revisit it. I also thought about getting like a hardware like slider thing so I can
Yeah.
modulate the voice that way. But this is me really overthinking my campaigns as usual.
Well, but then again, and you're also focusing on pitch, just pitch. That's because that's all a voice modulator is going to do for you. It's not going to change the shape of your mouth. It's not going to change the phrasing of your words. It's only going to change your pitch, which may be good, may be fine as far as it goes, right? But it doesn't go very far. Well, I mean, again, you have a history in theater. I mean, have you guys played in your theater involvement? Have you done uh, characters with accents? Have you had accent training of any sort?
It's in training?
Well, I
No,
mean,
but
well,
we've played
or
characters with accents.
yeah,
I recall like vaguely maybe for something there was some like a session akin to training. I
We
can't
did a
think now,
lot for
but
Spoon River, which was
oh
very
yeah,
weird.
that's weird.
I asked that
Uh,
because I have friends in high school that I had friends that back in high school when they did Brigadoon, they had actually somebody come in and do a session of accent training with them. That's why I asked that.
like one of my most consistent accents is the Spanish accent, but I was never trained in how to do this. I just think of my family, my great grandparents in Spain, and my grandparents in Cuba. Cuba, it goes it's a little deeper and it's a little more slurred words. And then the like the Puerto Riqueño it's this is almost Mexican, but it's not all the way. It's a very subtle difference. It's very subtle, almost like Miami. If you go to Miami, they speak like this. And so that's the arc of like Spanish to Italian I can sort of do, but that's just born out of experience and
That's
um
brilliant, though. That's brilliant
yeah.
because, like I said, my dwarves are Scotch Irish, right? They're not Highland Scottish. They're not Lowland Scotch. They are just some weird bastardization of Scotch and Irish. And the fact that you've got different Hispanic voices stands to reason, right? British English, Australian English. My Australian is Cockney for some reason. It's Cockney that says mate and oi. I'd be better off just making it Cockney and forgetting the Australian part of it, but I can't for some reason. I always worry too myself on a personal level, and I worry about when I'm doing a voice. At what point does it become caricature? Like if I were to do a Hispanic voice, I'm probably going to, sadly enough, I am going to do like this. I am going to remember back to my childhood and this Speedy Gonzales,
Yeah, I
which
was
is
about to
very
say.
racist character. And why would you do Speedy Gonzales? Because that is so terrible and it is so not a good thing at all. So I'm going to stop it right now on on the chance that Mr. Lopez is going to fire me as a DM. But I worry about that. I do. I worry about the caricature side of it.
Oh yeah, and like Indian is super dangerous to do because you end up sounding like Apu from Simpsons. which they don't even, it's not even a character anymore.
Right, right. No, that's with good reason. I mean, I like to think most players are patient enough and
Forgiving.
understanding and forgiving enough to recognize, that
You're
the
trying.
attempt, yeah, the attempt isn't malicious, right? But which is why, though, I feel like as a DM, I have a responsibility to make sure that the attempt is at least more than just caricature. Except for the Scotch Irish, fuck those guys. Um,
Darius, can you do a voice for everybody?
Sure. I mean, I think I try not to do like cultural voices. They're all just like wacky things from cartoons, but I also like talk to myself a lot. So it's like, hey, so you guys want to ride the Ferris wheel? It's going to be 2 punches out of your tickets, okay? And then, I'll give you another ride if you behave and you don't puke on me, okay? It's just like such a character, like it's just a cartoon voice. I
Like a
feel like is usually
Chainsmoker
what I
voice?
default into. Yeah.
yeah. Well, I
Almost
mean, but
like
I got some
Anselmo.
Italian there though from that. I got kind of some gangsta a little bit. You want a ticket? I'll take 2 punches if you throw up on.
Yeah.
Actually, if you throw up on
There you
me, I
go.
take 1 punch of the ticket, and I take 1 punch of you. So
Is
yeah,
this sort of stuff, I almost have to think about it after the session.
yeah.
Uh, like I'll even tell my players, all right, this is his new accent. I forgot his name. This is his new name. And then Haya will be like, oh, I actually wrote down his old name. I'm like, damn it. What's his name?
My one accent that I really think is true to life that I do, and it's probably my most practiced. It's the one that I've done. I'll do it in the mirror. It is the antebellum Southern gentleman. Now, when I first started doing this particular accent, it was very often more of a foghorn leghorn. I say, you understand, boy? But now it's more calculated and controlling and manipulative, very measured in both tone and vocabulary, and belying a deeper intention, whether it be beneficent or maleficent, benevolent or malevolent. I don't know, whichever the word is. So that's the one that I do, and because it's antebellum Southern, there's not really any current people group that I would feel like I would risk offending. Um, but you know, but I do. I think it's important. I do think that's important to pay attention, right? To like, you don't want to create a cartoonish, like Darius is saying. You don't want to offer a cartoonish version of certainly not of an ethnicity. Um, but that said, I think sometimes over the top caricature stuff, not necessarily in relation to ethnicity, can be valuable in D&D. Um, I have a character in the Obsidian Shards shared world in NPC he's basically a crime boss and very much Vita Corleone. I just can't get the. I really kind of want to stuff tissues in the corners of my mouth, like what's his name, like the actor, the famous actor guy
Yeah.
that played Vito
Uh,
Corleone, like he actually did during the
what, Marlon Brando, I
Brando.
think is his
Yeah,
name.
just like Brando. I want to do like Brando did. He actually stuffed marbles or some shit in his mouth. That was his thing. So I do some of those, but yeah, again, at the end of the day, I think voice is the last component. I think the personality, I think the composure, your posture, your body, what your mouth is physically doing is way more important than. And then you can start thinking about what the tongue is doing, and you can watch their YouTube videos that'll teach you how to speak French with a French accent, for example, or whatever. And those are useful to some degree. But it's really all about the physical positioning of the face and the body and the diaphragm, where you're speaking from in the whether it's deep, whether it's from the chest, whether it's in the gut.
Yeah, this sort of goes back to just players doing unexpected things. Whenever I have to invent a character immediately, like they go to the bartender, like "I- there is a bartender, there must be a bartender. The bar is not unattended, but I don't know anything about the bartender. So, just coming up with that character. I can't think of like the
Tony, you should always have a
personalities of the
bartender.
accents.
You should always have multiple bartenders ready. What is wrong with you? No, I mean, spend a little less time working on the tactics of that pack of orcs and a little more time on bartenders, maybe.
Or the animations. I spent a ton of time on
Like,
this trap door that nobody found.
or you just go like the easy way out, and no one, the bartender's name is Bartender. Like that's what I did. With, like this dentist NPC. His name's Dentist. I didn't like think you would engage with him, let alone take him hostage. Um, but all of a sudden he had to be named.
It
Well,
took several times in Darius's campaign. My giant bunny has used an NPC as an improvised weapon, and, and it's always been taken away from me.
I'm not really surprised by any of that, frankly. Bart names are another one, and this has always been a thing, right? Like in D&D, where some people are just not into coming up with a cool fantasy name for their character, and sometimes it's just, uh, who am I? I'm Thwack. I'm Thwack. I'm a barbarian.
I love that name.
You
That's a
know,
great name.
I'm just Thwack. And one of the kids last week from this high school played a Goliath, uh, and he was a druid, relatively new to civilization, and he had his name, of course, but among his Goliath tribe, names were like a sacred thing or whatever. And so when he came into civilization, he decided he needed a new name. So first person he ran into saw they said, "Whoa, that's a big guy." So the character's name, Dassa. Dassa
That's a big
Biggie.
guy.
Dassa Biggie. Biggie. Dassa Biggie. So his name, Dassa Biggie. Yeah.
Have you ever seen the riff tracks of Space Mutiny, or it might have been Mystery Science Theater? I think it was Mystery Science Theater Space Mutiny, where they had this. It was like this hulky character, and every time he came on screen, they would call him a different name. So it's like
Yeah.
slab, bulkhead, fridge, large meat, punch,
Yes.
speed chunk.
Exactly. Well, and my Sunday night game, I have a Sir McMeatshield, the paladin. Sir McMeatshield. There was a time that stuff bothered me. Like, get into it, get into the immersion. How can I have a true fantasy world if your name is hit things? I don't care anymore. Maybe it's age. I don't.
Yeah, my
There are things that used to be important that aren't nearly as important.
my character Hassenpfeffer is named after a rabbit stew.
Oh, I know. I was going to call that out. I'd forgotten it for a minute. You said his name was Hassenpfeffer. Now,
Or
was that his given name, or was that something he acquired after meeting humans who wanted to boil him?
uh no, I think his background doesn't really involve parents or community. He just sort of came into being. I haven't really thought that out, but he was always kind of on his own. He was inspired by a character from Big Buck Bunny was the name of the
Okay.
short, the animated short that he was from.
All right. I'll have to
Just
look
a
it up.
sort of like lovable, like gentle giant bunny who grows a lot of rage toward these chipmunks that killed a butterfly.
7.5 feet tall bunny.
It sounds a little artsy fartsy. I don't know if I would be into it. All right, Darius, what are your characters' names that you've played? Some of your favorite characters, or I don't know how many you've played, but
Um, I try to like think relatively hard about names. Not the first one. The current paladin is Kaijax. I think because that came from I was playing Sorrow of the Seas, and like I was thinking of Kaiju because he's like a dragonborn. And I was like, well, Kaijax because like he's tough, and like Kai Sword sounded stupid. Um,
yeah.
yeah, what else? Like, oh, naming tabaxis is always fun. So like my tabaxi is Moss on Rolling Rock, which just goes by Moss. Yeah, I think I've given. I think my trouble is like for whatever reason, whenever like a one shot happens, I probably put too much character development into those because like, and that's when I should like take my foot off the gas. Really, I think like we did a Christmas Tony, we did like a Christmas one shot where we were all kobolds, and I think my character's name was just like Gobstopper, and he was like a cleric, but like all he had like a pouch and like it was all different types of candy were his spell components. It was probably like the lowest effort in terms of like naming and concepting a character.
I often start with fantasy name generators, and so like Sisasas was a name generated from the fantasy name generator, but I sort of liked that it was just a hissing sound. uh,
Sure.
and then like my Arakakra was the name generated was Kekes, which I thought sounded like kick
Kick
ass.
ass.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh great.
Mine is funny. So like I say, I play Elven Wizards mostly when I play. You know, I've talked about that before. I like to play sort of just that same iconic character, and invariably it's something similar. Like, well, when I was 13 and first playing Dungeons and Dragons, 12 years old maybe, it was Silvermoon because that was the elf in the written adventure in the player's, or maybe it was the DM's book. Anyway, in the red box, the old red box set. So it was, or I'm sorry, Silverleaf, and so Silverleaf was the elf that I played, and then um, in my 20s, when I was a regular player in a campaign, he became Silvermoon, right? Still the silver, but it was really the same character that I was playing, different editions and all that. And then eventually it became, I decided to give him a first name, so it was Lucinian, and which then eventually became with another game and another iteration, and it became Laushan. So now for the last, I don't know, 3 or 4 years, whenever I play an Elven Wizard, doesn't matter if it's the same campaign or not, he's been Laushan Silvermoon. And yeah, I mean, I've become what I beheld, and I'm content that I've done what is right, I guess. You know, I watch my players name their players Gronk the second, and so, you know, you can't beat them, join them, I suppose.
Do you allow a player to come back after dying as basically the same player, or do you discourage that?
I mean, in general, uh, you know, I don't like forbid it. Discourage would be the right word. Um, but I mean, I definitely don't forbid it. I'll never forget one of my good friends, Kelly, played a paladin by the name of Moltar, and he died in the third session. And so then he came back as his identical twin brother, Ratnam, which is Moltar backwards. Ratlam survived the entire fucking rest of the campaign. Moltar, cool name, 3 sessions. Ratlam, weird name backwards, rest of the campaign.
That's
Uh,
I almost want a house rule that nobody dies before fourth level because it's so disappointing. It's very dangerous before third level at least. It's very dangerous, and people put a ton of effort. I put a ton of effort into this one character who died, and to hold person. Uh, and I just, as a snap decision, I made my next character a satyr who's like resistant or like immune to hold person, and like was just very tanky and defensive. And the only reason I did that is because I was really upset about this one character dying, and I didn't want it to happen again. But like, what I really wanted was that character back.
but not everybody's the same, right? Some people thoroughly enjoy um, short bursts of character. Like they enjoy playing. Like I want to dabble for in barbarian for like three or 4 sessions. Then, gosh, I wonder what it would be like to play a cleric and so on. So I think making it a hard and fast rule is probably not ideal. But there is a degree to which you got to read your players. Um, I don't have an official rule against character death. Right? For many people, part of what makes the game interesting is the genuine potential for failure. Um, and I've had, as a professional, as a paid DM, I have had 4 TPKs. which in the last year, which sounds like a lot, but again, remember I'm running 8 to 10 campaigns every week, um, so in the grand scheme of things, it's not as bad as it sounds. And then I've had maybe a dozen or more on top of that individual character deaths. Um,
This character that the previous campaign, a player had a bard who died the second session. And then, so we started a new campaign, and the DM jokingly said, if anyone plays a bard, I promise not to kill you the second session. And I was playing a bard, and the second session, my character died. And then I was like, actually,
Point of order.
you did promise. And so he laughed about it and said, like, all right, the hag didn't eat you. You didn't taste good, and she threw you out naked.
That's terrible. Tony, you might want to speak to your therapist about some of this this fear of death, but no, I'm.
Well, it's like I said, very early levels.
No,
It's disappointing. If it's level 8, then I'm excited to make a new character. And sometimes in your campaign, like I just made a new character because it's like I don't like this character anymore.
Yeah.
And Darius has even said, like, if at any point you don't like this barbarian anymore, we'll move on.
And I sort of make a joke about therapy, but let me make a clear point, not to Tony necessarily, but I mean to everyone. I'm a lifelong DM partly because I have generalized anxiety disorder, and for me, anxiety comes from a lack of control, and so part of being a DM is having a greater degree of control. So I do talk to my therapist about it. So when I say that jokingly, I don't want anybody to think for a minute I'm berating therapy and whatnot.
Therapy's great.
Part of my
Almost
growth,
everyone should see a therapist.
I agree. Part of my growth as a DM has come from my ability as a human to not need that same level of control. And so when I say Rule 0 is garbage, that's been a hard fought battle for me to get to that place. So there's some free advice for everybody. All right, well, we are out of time. Tony, Darius, thank you so much for being here today. I am the Ask the DM program will continue. I'm reworking some scheduling things, and I think the Tuesday slot is potentially going to be a different stream. I may be moving Ask the DM to Thursday, but I will, of course, Tony, I'll keep you updated so you can participate to whatever degree you're interested. And Darius, love to have you back sometime. It's been fun.
Thanks.
All right, we'll see everybody next time. Make sure and check us out Thursday night on Twitch, YouTube, and Facebook for Rise of the Drow, the Syndicate, starring Zizasas, starring
the
Tony.
leader of the group.
That's right.